once I get voided of my sense of self, usually the abuser or the manipulator can put into me whatever it is that they want me to be. A lot of feelings of irritability and constantly being on the edge, like your body can't exhale. When we stay in this prolonged states of stress, eventually we lose our sense of self. But if someone is coming into my boundaries, and if a relationship has a toxic pattern, and if someone is displaying any kind of abusive behavior, there's no reason for me to.
What's the long-term consequences of living in an abusive relationship? What does it do to our sense of self? To answer that question today, Dr. Jalali joins me. She's also a psychologist as well as an expert in trauma and has a new book coming out this fall called The Fire That Makes Us. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Jalali. In fact, you have a new book coming out called Fire That Makes Us. I'm so excited. Actually, I'm really excited about that. I want to make sure to get a copy of it when it gets released. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into psychology and specifically your interest in trauma?
Well, let me start by saying hello to everyone and just to express how excited I am to be here. Thank you for having me. You know, I often kind of repeat this phrase that most people who find themselves in this realm of work don't necessarily choose to be here, but they're somehow drawn to it, whether it's through their own life experience or, you know, kind of going after some form of healing in some form or shape. I guess what brought me to the field was I almost finished a PhD actually in linguistics when I was in my 20s. And once I got to that point, I went through what you can refer to as a midlife crisis, and it made me question my choices, where I was in life. So I started seeking therapy with a Jungian analyst, and the whole process was so core-shaking to me that after I went through it, I couldn't imagine doing anything else with my life. So I kind of redirected everything. I moved. I started to go back to school, and I did my master's in marriage and family therapy and did my doctorate in clinical psychology and been working in the field since.
That's incredible. Wow. What a transformation to move from linguistics over to psychology.
I know.
Yeah, that's big. And you said core shaking. Can you say, you know, it's interesting because I found looking at my own trauma also core shaking. I mean, because it's around the definition of self.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of things do you think people discover when they start to work on and start to heal from particularly abusive relationships or maybe a past trauma of abuse from trauma?
Mm-hmm. You know, I use the word core shaking because in my opinion, prior to this, I always assumed that this was my life. And I was born into this dynamic. You know, I am who I am. There is no way to necessarily step away from it in any way that's fundamental for me. And going through this process of analysis, I came to the realization that no, this is the version of me that I've come to know. It's not necessarily me in my entirety. And I can be so much bigger, stronger, different than the way I have come to know myself or to define myself, whatever that belief system around that is. And the ability to be able to be different, to do different, to go about things differently is what was core shaking to me, because prior to that, that wasn't accessible to me. And I think what I wanted everybody else to find out is that you have access to this. You're not enslaved to whatever your story is.
That's powerful because for me, this is what it felt like. My trauma started toddlerhood probably. And it felt like for me that I was forced down. If it was like a fork on a road and I was forced down a particular fork. And I've heard other survivors say similar things, like whether it's maybe a toxic relationship or a very dysfunctional family, they feel like it's such a shaping experience of identity that they end up feeling like they don't know who they would have turned out to be. Like they've lost that self that could be because of the trauma. And what I'm hearing is you're speaking of potential. Like there's more hope than that.
Absolutely. The potential is infinity, right? I mean, none of us actually reach our true potential in this lifetime, in my opinion. We strive for it, some of us more than others. So it's good to know we have access to it if we wanted to try. I think the problem is most of us just believe whatever it is that we're given or we have access throughout our lifetime, given our story. So we just continue to repeat those patterns. We hear that a lot in psychology, right? Patients often come to me and say, I find myself in the same relationship with different people, but same relational pattern over and over again. And I think what's important for people to realize is that pattern is absolutely breakable. It's not that you're this sick person who repeatedly picks a negative pattern. It's that that's what you know, or that's what's alluring to you given your wounding. So if you recognize that wounding and heal from it, then just automatically, not even by trying, that pattern will no longer be attractive to you, or you won't be target to that pattern anymore, if that makes sense.
It does. Dr. Karen Mitchell's proposing, it's come out of a very large study of 26,000 respondents in a self-report survey of men, specifically of men, who self-reported that 1 out of 3 have been abusive in a relationship. And her point was, it's not even so much that we attract them, it's that highly prevalent, which I know a lot of times we tend to want to almost pathologize victims by saying you somehow have something wrong with you because you've been broken, and now you're drawing that person in. And maybe the truth of it is, no, it's just that prevalent. It's that common that we're unfortunately living in a world that's not very safe, and that we need to become more aware of that and not shame ourselves. I wonder what your thoughts about that is.
I don't disagree with you at all. I think the key here is, even though it's prevalent, when you're kind of aware of that, then you respond to it differently. You refuse to get victimized by it, right? And I think that's what matters, whether or not you're falling into that trap or recognizing it, setting proper boundaries. And when it's not possible to have that in place, walking away from it if necessary.
What do you think victims miss in the beginning, and maybe partly because of the way in which the trauma has taken root in themselves and start to become living in them? What can you describe that process, first of all?
Yes. So what happens is our mind needs to repeat the cycles it knows in order to either kind of just, it finds comfort in them because better the devil you know than the devil you don't, or if it's uncomfortable, it tends to want to resolve it somehow. So it puts itself back in that position to be able to, this time around, maybe find a solution or work through it. I mean, you probably heard this a lot where patients say, my father was an alcoholic. I promised myself I would never end up with an alcoholic. And then I married twice and they're both alcoholics, right?
Right.
What is happening here? The person is somehow, because as a child, you're helpless. There's nothing you can do, right? But there's this hope inside of them that as an adult, I can fix this person. I can overcome this. And hopefully that will heal whatever it is that I went through in my childhood, right? So for these two different reasons, we find ourselves in similar patterns, usually patterns that we're trying to avoid. Now, when we can work through that initial wound, what will happen is the brain will automatically give up the need to put itself back in that dynamic again. As such, that notion is no longer that attractive to us. So it's not that I am necessarily recognizing something and stepping away from it. It's just that it loses its allure for me. I'm no longer wanting to chase that anymore. There's no reason for me. So now I'm potentially in a more healed space of mind. So I get attracted to dynamics that resemble that essentially. Now, that doesn't mean I will never find myself in a negative relationship again, because as you know, healing is so multifaceted. And even though there's so many unhealthy people in the world that even if I'm the most healed person ever, I still may come across people who tend to hurt me, whether intentionally or unintentionally, right? But recognizing those patterns and learning how to navigate them properly when they do show up.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've noticed the same thing, that there's sort of this compulsion for mastery, which gets us into the bad position of picking similar situations without even meaning to. It's interesting that you phrase that it becomes less attractive to us. Meaning you see that the compulsion drops. There's not this need to repeat, to solve, even though we actually usually don't solve it. We usually just repeat it. Yeah. So how can someone know if they're moving in the right direction of healing?
I think the best way to recognize that is to see this is the most important process in emotional wellness. Check-ins with yourself and noticing how you're feeling as the world continues to run its course. So if I find myself in distress most of the time, if I find myself feeling anxious or depressed or ruminating or just feeling overtly hypervigilant most of the time, that tells me something. My psyche is trying to communicate with me, right? So if I learn to listen, then I'm going to start doing something about that. So if I work, 16-hour days and I find myself extremely fatigued all the time, that fatigue is there to tell me something. It's not just showing up for no reason. So if I learn to respond to that, then I'm going to stop and say, wait a second, I don't think this pattern really works for me. How can I cut back a little bit, meanwhile maintain all my responsibilities? And once I start to respond to that differently, chances are the fatigue will go down. So the psyche again communicates with us. And if we learn to do this regularly, which is technically in the essence of mindfulness, being very present with yourself and what happens around you, eventually we start to just automatically take steps that take us towards healing and kind of getting out of destructive patterns, whatever that may be for each one of us.
Let's for a moment even move back earlier in a relationship. Often we're in these relationships. I'm thinking of adult pathological love relationships. We get into a relationship with somebody, and we've kind of been instructed that relationships are challenging. They're not easy. We don't recognize the early signs of emotional abuse. Maybe it's been normalized in our own family. What do we do with that emotion when we're experiencing this uncomfortable situation that it's probably, I know psychology thinks that there's big T's in trauma and there's little T's in trauma. And this would be an example of little T's that start to stack up. What happens internally in us when we're in a less than safe situation?
Well, we compromise parts of ourselves to the extent that we're able to. So we do this every day in everyday life patterns. It doesn't necessarily even have to be an abusive relationship, for example, right? But we continue to do so until it's no longer accessible to us. It's kind of like, imagine you have a bank account and you have $100 in there, and now you're spending without replenishing that account. And eventually you're going to get to a point that there is zero money left in there. Right now, most of us tend to even go to the negative. We continue to spend after
become bankrupt.
Exactly. So once we get to that point, that's when things start to break down. So either we have actual physiological symptoms that kind of lead to illnesses or all sorts of issues that we have to deal with, or we actually break down in the relationship, or we start mirroring whatever it is the other person's doing to us, or we start detaching, and that has its own kind of ramifications that follows. But regardless, we tend to uh, push ourselves beyond our limits. We override our emotions. To your point, a lot of that comes from, first of all, our belief system, especially as a woman. I think we are taught by most societies that we need to be tolerant of things that we don't like. And a lot of it is normalized. Like if someone cheats on you, let's say in a heterosexual relationship, I come from a Middle Eastern background, and it's very well accepted that, well, men cheat. It's okay, whereas you don't have to tolerate if that kind of behavior if you don't want to, right? So just noticing, when I first meet with a patient, what I have them do is try to recognize their true self, their own belief systems, despite what they have been taught by their parents, by society, by their teachers, their peers. What is it that I am comfortable with? Most of us don't even know that.
Yeah, because I was thinking when you said that they may even be getting the pressure from around them to say, and it shouldn't be that upsetting because we all know that men do that. When betrayal like that is an extreme act of violence, there's often a kind of a ego shattering experience around having that kind of trust betrayed. So here's this, I'm almost imagining, well, actually I've experienced it. There's a split that occurs. It's like what I felt is like what everyone around me thinks I should do, but there's also my internal experience of what's happening to me, and then my simultaneous need for support and maybe lack of support that I'm getting, which is really quite a terrible bind to be put in.
I agree. There's a kind of a trend going on right now. I see a lot of quotes or memes on different social media platforms where the previous generations actually fought for relationships. It's easy to break things and move on. You want to be tolerant. You want to kind of put up with things that you don't like. No one is going to be exactly who you want them to be. As much as I agree with that message, I also think it can be very toxic for people who are in bad relationships, and they try to justify bad behavior by saying, well, if I don't put up with something, I'm going to end up alone. Putting up with something is very different than compromising. If my needs are to some extent getting met and there are things in this relationship that I don't like, but they're within my window of tolerance and they're not hurting me or anybody else, yes, by all means, I want to encourage people to do that. But if someone is coming into my boundaries, and if a relationship has a toxic pattern, and if someone is displaying any kind of abusive behavior, there's no reason for me to tolerate that in any shape or form. In fact, doing so is just going to make me more and more dependent and eventually sick in many ways.
Yeah, exactly. And I know what you're speaking of. There's this kind of this dichotomy that's happening in the larger world, which is there's a lot of us that's saying you should get out of a relationship that's unhealthy. It's not good for you. It's going to eventually affect you, physiologically, psychologically affect you. But then there's another group that says, but we're just sort of abandoning relationships here and there over maybe small stuff. And I do think sometimes the pendulum swings too far and like we've ignored. I mean, the fact that even we're talking about emotional abuse, and most people probably, if you ask them on the street, can't identify it. They don't really know what it is. To the point that now that the minute someone looks at me wrong, I'm done with them and we're going to block them. Yeah, I know that we're kind of we're swinging, and it makes sense because we're trying to figure out where is the midline in this process. What I've seen, though, is when there's a long-term kind of tolerance of a toxic relationship, it does very powerfully affect us. Kind of speak to what happens physiologically and psychologically to us when we are in long-term psychologically dangerous relationships.
Yes, it definitely has its impact on us, as you pointed out, both emotionally and physically. So physically, we start to notice somatic symptoms, headaches, jaw clenching, fatigue. Those are just to name a few. We usually start to see disrupted sleep patterns, sometimes vivid dreams, nightmares. Obviously, chronic stress impacts our nervous system and kind of causes a lot of dysregulation. We have a lot of sympathetic overdrive when we are in that continuous state. We usually see a lot of gut issues, hormonal imbalances due to cortisol overload, a lot of feelings of irritability and constantly being on the edge, like your body can't exhale. It's continuously jumpy and waiting for the next thing to happen. Emotionally, there's usually chronic self-doubt, kind of like, was it really that bad? Did I, overreact? There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of hypervigilance. There's a lot of emotional dysregulation, guilt and shame cycles, especially after defending yourself. And my own personal pet peeve is identity confusion. Kind of you lose your sense of self. And this is where things start to go south. And then eventually most people end up in a lot of numbness and shut down because it's almost impossible to tolerate that state for a prolonged state of time.
So talk more about the identity confusion. That was fascinating to me.
Yes. See, the most important thing that keeps us intact and allows us to go through life in a well-balanced, functional way is our sense of self. When we stay in this prolonged states of stress, eventually we lose our sense of self. So when I don't know who I am, people can treat me in any way they want. They can do whatever they want to me. I can't find my path. I feel lost. I'm never happy or satisfied because I don't know even what it is that I want. I have lost touch with who I am.
It reminds me, there was a commentator that was pulled out, like, I don't know if this is an interview or a statement he was making, and I'm not really familiar. It's more like one of those late night shows, and he was using Cassie's voicemail to Diddy about one of the upcoming freak shows, about her saying, I can't wait for it. And that how could they then say she found them traumatizing and abusive if that's the voice message she left. And somebody pulled it out and said, yeah, but that's a reflection of somebody who's learned to survive. And I think that would be a perfect example of what you're talking about, identity confusion. I mean, if we could have gotten into the interior of Cassie at that moment, she probably said, no, I don't think it's a great thing. I don't even want to be a part of it, but I also know what was going to happen to me if I don't go along. So I'm playing my part. I mean, what do you think? Was that expression of that?
See, that's actually a very good example because once I get voided of my sense of self, usually the abuser or the manipulator can put into me whatever it is that they want me to be. Right?
Yeah.
So, and this is usually the goal of the abuser, whether they're conscious or just unconsciously doing this. Their goal is for me to get, or for whoever the victim is, to get completely void of their own sense of right, wrong, what's good, what's bad for me. So then I can adapt whatever it is that they want me to do.
Yeah. In fact, my ex said his perfect woman was someone who slept at the foot of the bed and did whatever he wanted at 24 hours a day. So in other words, we're saying that's a non-person. There is no person in that person. There's no personhood. So yeah, I see that there's this emptying out of the victim and a replacement with the abuser's desire.
Correct.
Don Hennessy, in his book called How He Gets Into Her Head, talks about the replacement of language. That when they are grooming you and they start to hear you use the words they use, they know they're starting to replace yourself with them around the use of, because words is symbolic and expression of who we are.
Correct.
It's mind blowing. I think that's what we don't appreciate is that at that point, the victim doesn't really have a good sense of who they are. They're just trying to survive the situation.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, so you talk about the fire that makes us. How in your, and I know that you shared a little bit before we went on air about the fact that you use your own story as a way to sort of illuminate that. So I take it from that you've survived a lot as well, and that the fire has made you. So how did you find your sense of self in this recovery process?
So first of all, let me just add that I don't think you can be a human being in this world and reach a certain age and not claim that you pretty much survived life, no matter how good you haven't. Because at its best, life can be very difficult at times.
Yeah, good point.
But I went through an actual physical accident that was very traumatic about 12, 13 years ago with my family members in the car, and the accident resulted in a lot of loss as well as a lot of personal injury for myself. I had to go through a very difficult recovery. And obviously, I received a lot of therapy after in order to come to terms with everything that had happened. And as I was going through this, part of my way of coping with it was I was writing about a lot of my emotions. Because there was a lot of numbness. I couldn't connect with certain parts of me. So I was trying to kind of reconnect and forgive myself and forgive the whole process. Because as you know, any kind of traumatic event has a lot of guilt and shame associated with it, no matter what your role in the process. And as I was writing this, one of my sisters at one point picked up some of my writing and said, you need to turn this into a book, because there are a lot of people who go through trauma, and, I think this can be helpful for them. So I actually put it together with all my clinical experience, everything that I had seen, patterns that patients had kind of brought to my attention over the years of how people get stuck in particular dynamics. And then we go through life fully functional. I mean, I thought at the time I was a very functional adult. I didn't think, like, if you would see me, I would get up early in the morning, I would work out, I would go to work, I had relationships, I had a life. And if you would have asked me, I was like, yeah, I'm completely healed from this and moved on, not knowing the silent hand it had in controlling my life, my emotions, the way I showed up, the parts of me that were still stuck in this whole thing and kind of running the show silently, right? So, in order to paint this picture, I think the book is about 20 chapters. It starts by telling a story of obviously a fictional character that's based on what I went through and a lot of the stories of the patients. And then at the end of each chapter, I talk about the psychological dichotomy of what this person is going through. And there is a segment on kind of guiding people on how to address these issues, how to overcome them, how to embrace them, how to respond to them, essentially, given whatever the pattern may be. And what I'm hoping it would do is it will work as a guideline to kind of help people who've been in these dynamics to, first of all, recognize them, because I think that recognition is the most important thing. The problem is most of us don't know these are there. And if you sit with patients, the first thing you ask them is, how you doing? And they usually say, good, everything's good. Because what we know of our lives, in some way, we have to come to terms with it. Otherwise, none of us would survive life, right? It has to get really bad for people to actually admit, you know what, I'm in a crisis. Most of us just kind of work our way around whatever it is that we're going through and kind of come to peace with it somehow.
It's almost amazing to me, because right now I'm coming into an anniversary of, it's 10 years ago that my late husband passed away from a very, very rare, very brutal form of cancer. And it was a terrible experience. And but you're right. We move through these experiences and we're surviving. I didn't stop and ask myself, Kerry, how are you doing today? I'm like, what do I need to do to get through today to deal with this really horrific thing? But yet, looking back and recalling what I survived, I ended up thinking, I wouldn't have wished that on anybody. I mean, what I saw, I wish I'd never known. I mean, didn't see, wish I didn't experience. I wish he hadn't gone through that. I can't imagine his experience of dying that way. But it's amazing to me how we do that. We kind of, it's almost like I almost see like a dichotomy between two groups of people. There's some people whose protest behavior around what they experience is so intense, we don't know what to do with it. It almost like drowns us. And then there's the other group who minimizes what they went through. And when you listen to it, you're stunned because it's so horrific and you recognize they are not in touch with the severity of what they went through.
Correct.
So, yeah, it's hard to know how to help either group. That's what I find. It's hard. I find that sometimes it's learning how to sit with the person who's in the pain, but also learning how not to be swamped by the person who's drowning in the pain.
1 foot in, 1 foot out, right? And if we go completely into the pain, we can never come out of it, I think. So that's why I always guide the patients to go to the edge of their discomfort, but not step into it completely, because it can be very paralyzing if we don't have the proper tools to deal with it. So you're absolutely right. I think that's the challenge. And eventually, as a clinician, you learn how to navigate that. And hopefully you can set the precedent for the people who are going through it, because it's very tough, to your point, to identify that, kind of level of comfort.
It is. It is very difficult. Well, Dr. Jalali, this has been really wonderful to talk about today. I want to jump over to the podcast extra, and let's follow up on that thought. If you're someone that recognizes that maybe you're almost like a fire hose of emotion and you're drowning those around you with the pain, or maybe you're actually you're less than I'm thinking like a sprinkle hose, and you know that what you've been surviving is backed up and constricted. And you're really not getting the support. Let's talk about both what to do next in the podcast extra. But how can people find out more about you? This actually is going to be airing around the time of the release of your book. So I also would love you to talk about that. But where can they find you, more about your work, but also more about the book that's coming out?
No, absolutely. Well, I run 2 private practices here in Newport Beach, California. So they can find us on the websites, Dr. Jalali and Associates, as well as Align Remedy. There's also a website by the name of the book, The Fire That Makes Us, or my name, Shahrzad Jalali. I have a couple of different social media accounts under either Dr. Jalali PsyD or Align Remedy that they can find kind of informational videos or posts that hopefully is helpful to them. I will share all my contact information with you, and hopefully you can give everyone access to that.
I would love to do that. Thank you so much for being our guest today. I deeply appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode. Are you following me on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube? You can find me at Kerry McAvoy, PhD. Or you can learn more about me and my resources, such as the Toxic Free Relationship Club, at kerrymcavoyphd.com. And I'll see you back here next week.